Hello, I'm Lisa Ayers, Director of Communications at the Realtor Association of the Fox Valley, and welcome to the February edition of our new panel series, Real Estate Experience Live. This is a series created by the RAFV Technology and Communications Committee. The goal of this series is to tackle real issues in real estate with Realtors. This is a monthly series, so we'll be looking for this every month. And our topic today is Eviction Moratorium and Forbearance Explained. But before we get into the discussion, I'd like to say thank you to our panelists for taking your time to educate us on these topics. And I would also like to thank everyone in the viewing audience for joining us. If you have questions, be sure to put them in the chat box and we'll get to them as soon as we can. So let's get started. First, let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Matthew Rentchler, Illinois Realtors Legislative Attorney. Matthew has been with Illinois Realtors since this time last year, but prior to his appointment in Springfield, Matt served as the Chief Legal Counsel for the Illinois State Police. And prior to that, he served as in-house corporate counsel for a retail company with over 100 stores in the U.S. Please welcome Matthew Rentchler. Next, we have Paul Kempa, Designated Managing Broker for Kempa Realty, and in recent years, Realty One Group Excel in Aurora. Paul is the immediate past president for RAFV and has over 20 years of experience in residential real estate and property management. Please welcome Paul Kempa. Next, we have Larry Hines of Remax Horizon in Elgin. A lifelong Fox Valley resident, Larry has been selling and investing in real estate for over 40 years. Larry currently manages many properties in the Fox Valley area and has a wealth of experience in that arena. Welcome, Larry. And lastly, to round out our experienced panel, we have Miguel Fernandez of HomeSmart Connect in Elgin. Miguel is RAFV's president-elect and has the rare experience of being not only a realtor, but also a real estate attorney. Who better to lead our panel than Miguel? Please welcome Miguel Fernandez.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Real Estate Experience Live. And we wanted to have this discussion today because we're coming up on about the 1-year anniversary of all things COVID shutdown related. And about that time when businesses and people's ability to make money came to a near screeching halt, the government took some steps to ease the difficulties related to housing, which is where we get into forbearance and the eviction moratorium. Just to define both of those terms, forbearance is when your lender or loan servicer basically puts a pause or allows you to reduce your payments for a certain period of time. And at this point, the forbearance is going on for just about a year on residential mortgages. And we're coming up to that's about to expire at the end of this month or the end of March at the federal level with some of the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and HUD programs. And we also want to discuss the eviction moratorium because we have investor clients who not only own property, but are landlords. And when people can't pay their rent, then we get into difficulties. And as part of protecting people's housing to keep people off the streets, to prevent COVID spread, there's a pause, a moratorium, a temporary prohibition on the eviction process, which is how we colloquially speak about how we get people out of someone's house when they are no longer paying rent and fulfilling those obligations. The legal term for the actual action is forcible entry and detainer. But as of now, there's a hold, which in Illinois has been spread through the governor's executive orders. And so that's just kind of a bit of background as to why we're having this discussion today and what the forbearance and the eviction moratorium are. But the Illinois Realtors have done a very good job of explaining how things are in this ever-evolving legal landscape is going forward. And so we're turning to Matthew Rentchler to give us an update on where things are legislatively. So Matt, can you fill us in, elaborate a little more?
Well, the short answer is it's kind of everything's up in the air right now. In one respect, we had a new administration sworn in DC with President Biden, who has continued over some of the moratoriums, but also has different ideas in terms of how we move forward from this time on. There's currently legislation pending in Congress. We had back in December passed a $25 million grant program. There's another one introduced right now. And in terms of the moratoriums, as you said, in terms of forbearance, they already extended most of the federally backed loans moratorium on foreclosures until the end of basically the end of March through March. Fannie and Freddie maybe the end of February, but we expect those are likely be extended as well. And in terms of the eviction moratoriums, that is kind of two-tiered. There is a federal moratorium that's in place, and President Biden extended that as well through the end of March. However, there's the existing state moratorium that's in place, and that was just extended again this past weekend when we're taping this. That's now extended through March 6th. And if you're in Illinois, what you need to pay attention to is the eviction moratorium through the executive order, because that is more restrictive on what a landlord can do to evict than the federal moratorium is in a few respects. How the eviction moratorium works is, at least in Illinois, if you're under a certain income threshold, similar to the federal level, if you make less than $99,000 a year by yourself, or if you file jointly, if you make less than $298,000 a year, then you can submit to your landlord a declaration stating you meet this certain criteria. And once that's submitted, you're what's considered a covered person. And what the state moratorium says is a landlord cannot initiate an eviction proceeding or commence an eviction action against a covered person. Now, what commence means at the state level, that's one of the big differences between the state level and the federal level. The state commence basically can be interpreted as you can't file or you can't even issue a notice. It's kind of unclear, and it's really up to interpretation at the local level and how a judge would interpret that if someone were to be violating that. On the federal level, it says you can't evict a person. And how that's been interpreted by the CDC is you can't get a judgment, meaning the case can still be filed, it can still be argued, but they can't actually enter an order. And that's an important distinction because of that declaration. At the Illinois level, once you submit that declaration, you're a covered person. The question is, what if the landlord disagrees with that and still wants to file because they don't think you actually are a covered person? That's kind of up in the air. How does that dispute work? Well, if you can't even file a case, everything's still on pause. At the federal level, the judge can make that determination whether someone's actually a covered person or not. And that's a big difference from a landlord's perspective, and it's a big difference from a tenant's perspective in terms of the steps that they have to take to be covered by this moratorium. So it's a lot simpler from a tenant's perspective in Illinois than it would be if we were just covered by the federal moratorium. Meaning all they have to do is submit this paperwork versus having to go to court.
Right. So the Illinois moratorium doesn't even let the landlord press the issue as to whether or not there should be a moratorium applicable to the tenant. They just gotta wait it out, because if they even filed a case, they could get sanctioned.
Yeah, and that's something we tried to clarify some of this during a lame duck session back in December when the legislature was in to put it in statute. That's one of the things we talked about is, well, what if there's disagreement on whether this person's actually been impacted by COVID? How can we resolve that dispute? And that it never actually got passed. So that question's still out there. So if you're from playing it safe on the landlord's side, you just don't really want to do anything right now, unless to risk violating that moratorium.
There's a Cook County or a Chicago municipal ordinance on top of this, right? Which is probably even more restrictive, but we don't have a whole lot of information on that from our panel.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the local moratorium like Chicago is that's something else to keep in mind. The Chicago moratorium is linked to the state moratorium, meaning once the state moratorium expires or is lifted, the Chicago moratorium continues for another 60, I believe it's 60 days after that. So if you're in Chicago you need to check your local area as well, just because the state moratorium expires you may still be under this other moratorium on the local level. So
thank you, Matt. So Larry, sounds like landlords have been essentially unable to evict non-paying tenants for about a year now. Have you had any success with forcible entry and detainer eviction proceedings?
I've had one, but it was not a money-related situation. So when you're doing an eviction, you have a 5-day notice, which is a money situation, somebody who's late on their rent and all that kind of stuff. Then you have a 10-day, which is a lease violation. In the case that I actually had an eviction happen in October, and that's what that case was. That's because we had a tenant who wouldn't allow anybody to come in and fix a failing septic system. So we gave him a 10-day notice, wouldn't allow us on, finally got to court in McHenry County. Judge heard it. And the tenant showed up there, which was helpful. And then the judge allowed us to do an eviction. We had an eviction date with the sheriff to come out. That got postponed a week. As the sheriff questioned, as Matt was saying, can I enforce this? And the judge allowed it. So that's the only successful one I've had so far. And then there's a 30-day eviction notice or a 30-day notice. That's when the lease is expired and you don't want to renew anymore. Those are I don't even know if those will affect if a tenant's lease is up. Matt, I don't even know if I can enforce that today.
Well, and I forgot to mention that part, but that's an important additional part to the state moratorium is even if you're a covered person and you meet all the standards even if you're not a covered person and the landlord can technically file an eviction, get an order of possession and all that, there's another section within the moratorium that says that law enforcement can't enforce those orders right now. So that's where, like you said, from the sheriff's perspective, going strictly by the language of the state moratorium, by the executive order, they can't enforce those orders. So
30-day notice has no bite either right now.
Yeah, it just says eviction orders. It doesn't say what type. It just says eviction orders. So residential eviction. But.
Oh, what kind of experience have you had with evictions or attempted evictions? What sort of advice do you give your landlords?
Well, I'm kind of in the same boat as Larry, where if it's a payment issue, we're having a lot of difficulty doing anything. And what Matt talked about, that paperwork where you have to give if they're an approved, what do you call it? Not approved, but fall within, whatever that paperwork is. What the judge is requiring us to do is actually serve them that paperwork in order to see if they're an approved tenant where they won't be evicted. But you have to have proper service, and we do a lot of stuff in Cook County where if you do it yourself, a lot of times the judge will throw it out. So we have a process server that will do it. However, if you don't answer the door, you can't serve somebody. And what's happening now is we keep having these Zoom hearings or Zoom calls with the judge that keeps getting postponed every 30 days. So that hasn't had much success with that. I can tell you we've had, I think the wording that they're using, if they're a hazard to the community or other tenants, you should be allowed to evict them. We've had a shooting a couple of weeks ago in one of the houses. Judge said that wasn't good enough to evict them. We had a murder a couple months ago at one of the houses. Again, luckily we had those people moved on their own. But ultimately it's really up to the judge. Whatever judge you get is going to determine how they view what the wording is for doing an eviction. And that's kind of where we're stuck is every judge may say something different, but they're very tenant they're very tenant friendly. And I could tell you a lot of times the sheriff is not even going to come out and do an eviction, even if you get an eviction. So you're kind of stuck that way also.
Things are not only difficult for people who don't have a job and can't make rent payments, but the landlords can't even collect or evict, and they may be hoping that forbearance on their mortgage, if they have one, is being extended as well. So, Paul, just to clarify, you're saying that as far as you know, you've had to hire a process server to serve that declaration on the tenant before you can then use that information to decide whether to serve them with any kind of a 5-day notice or anything along those lines.
To give you an example, we have a tenant that was already properly served. We had the original court date. They did it, and then COVID hit. And then they went to Zoom meetings. So now the judge went back and said, well, we need you now to serve her this new declaration in order for us to keep continuing to move forward with the eviction process. So that's kind of where we've been stuck. They keep kind of tweaking the rules a little bit, for how they want to do the process.
Have either of you, Paul or Larry, had any success working with tenants to kind of either work out a payment plan or obtain rental assistance from any level of government?
I had some luck where some tenants applied for there was a $5,000 IDHA was offering to help some tenants. I had 3 tenants actually qualify for that, had a bunch more apply for it, but only 3 qualified. But I had the tenant applied, and then the landlord is being me managing them. I had to issue a copy of the lease. I issued a copy. I actually served them with a 5-day notice with that. So they had a record of how much they owed, which is more than the $5,000. But we did get $5,000 out of 3 of the people that I had. Now, hopefully, with this new program, more people will qualify for that. But I would tell people, as a landlord, is try to work something out with your tenants, because as they say, you can't get blood out of a turnip. And if they don't have the money now, the chance of getting caught up on 8, 9, 10, 12 months of rent is going to be almost impossible. So if you can work out some kind of a payment, if they've been great before that, it's not all their fault. And I work for a lot of landlords, so I take a landlord's perspective, but you do got to get into some kind of system where you can try to, even if you're getting, $200 a month out of them, it's something better than nothing right now.
Yeah, I would agree with Larry on that too, because we received a lot of the IDA payments for the tenants and landlords as well. And honestly, in the last 2 weeks, we've been picking up a lot more property management clients that they try to do it on their own. They're coming to us to see if we can help them out trying to collect rent and stuff like that. Ultimately, if you can get a hold of the tenant, most tenants, I would say, want to do the right thing. They just don't know what the right thing is. We've got probably 30 different charities, 30 different organizations that will kind of plug them into to help them get some funds to get caught up, to do a payment plan, stuff like that. These are charities that, some of them I've never even heard of, but they're willing to help out. The money's is there if you can figure out where it's at. That's the hardest problem, is to figure out where to get the money from, is what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, the important thing to remember, even though we're talking primarily on the landlord side, for both tenants and homeowners with a mortgage, the debt doesn't go away by the forbearance or the eviction moratorium. So whenever these safety measures, these protections go away, that debt is still owed. So it's best to proactively reach out to either your loan servicer or your landlord, property manager, and try to work out some sort of payment plan, be able to pay what you can in the interim, so that when it all comes due, it's not just slamming down on your head in one lump sum. And I know that I've read over the Illinois Declaration, and one of those criteria is supposed to be that your tenant has worked with the landlord to try to work out some payment plan to the extent that they can. It's the income, the fact that COVID actually did affect, and that there's been some sort of payment arrangement, and there's a fourth that I can't remember. Matt, so in terms of rental assistance and the help that we're looking right now at the federal level, and then that's sort of funding through the state. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, the state itself, for various reasons, doesn't have the money to give, but they're relying on federal money, and that federal money, we had the money last year that came in that was about 300 million distributed, both the mortgage relief and the rent relief. In the federal bill that was passed back in December, there was a specific amount listed and authorized of 25 billion to be given to states specifically for rent and utility relief. That money, because of how it's distributed based on census figures, the estimated amount that the state of Illinois will get will be between 800 and 900 million. So roughly 3 times as much as we had back in the fall last year. Now, an important part of caveat to that is that eligible grantees, which the state's a grantee, and the also state and local authorities that have a certain population amount can also be grantees. And that under this bill, that's 200,000 or more. So in terms of counties, that would be about 10 counties. And then obviously the city of Chicago, the city of Aurora is right on the line. But it's important to check not just at the state level, but depending on where you're located, your locality may have been the one who applied to distribute that money in that area. So I know Cook County applied. I'm sure the city of Chicago applied, but the collar counties, they would all qualify. They would have to apply for it. So, but if they didn't, then your distributed amount, your application would go to IDA, the state agency who distributed money back in the fall. What we don't know right now is what their specific application process and timeline will be, because as of today, those procedures are still being put into place. Those rules are still being discussed. So hopefully within the next week or two, we'll know more. But right now, all we really know is the amount that the state will roughly get as a whole, and then there's certain requirements of who can apply based on the federal requirements, which would be anyone under 80% of adjusted median income can apply, but they want to prioritize the funds for anybody who is 50% or less of adjusted median income or area median income. So that's roughly the same group of people who applied back in the fall, but there are slight differences in who will be eligible, who won't. But like I said, the state can always narrow that group more if it chooses to, but we won't know the exact answer to that until the actual rules and application process comes out.
Hey, Matt, just on the new wording, does it have it in there if somebody has a housing voucher that they'll be allowed to apply for this?
That's kind of the interpretation question. There is the language in there that says if you receive any other relief money that you can't double up is basically the intent of it. Before, the program back in the fall was if someone had say received Section 8 income, Section 8 vouchers, then they couldn't apply for this relief funds.
Okay.
It's still an open question on how the state's going to interpret the language under this new law, this new grant program. Based on discussions we had during Lane Duff's session about this, how this program is going to be implemented, like I said, the intent was that they didn't want people to double up on it. But if you have received prior grant money, you could still do it for rent that you haven't received assistance on now. So the basic answer is it depends, but for things like Section 8, I would anticipate those people wouldn't be eligible again just because they receive ongoing assistance and ongoing vouchers. But it's just one of those questions we won't know for sure until the state comes out with their actual final guidelines and restrictions.
Okay.
But I know that was a big issue back in the fall.
Yeah.
So there is some assistance out there, but like with everything else with COVID, it's ever changing, and we got to keep tabs, check government websites like the Illinois Housing Development Authority, Maybe Illinois Realtors might have some if they can get it and post it. But just reach out to local officials and see what you can figure out. Larry and Paul, I know I kind of asked you about how things going well with the eviction process, and it sounds like we got more worst case scenarios than good ones. But do you have any particular bad situations that stand out, and any advice that you might have from things that you learned from that?
Be prepared to have your numbers ready when this moratorium is ended. So because otherwise any situation you have will be worse. So if you're not in communication with your tenants now, you're in trouble, because they need to have an idea of where they're at. Now, I'm not telling you to call them every month and tell them, hey, you owe me another month's rent. Now you owe me $8,000. Now you owe me $10,000. You know, you're just going to add stress in those situations. People snap in different areas, right? You don't want to be in that situation. But you're also, I think if you're used to doing your own evictions, if you're an individual, if you're an LLC or a corporation, by law, you have to have an attorney do it. But I'm going to tell you, even if you're used to doing your own, this is the time to have an attorney prepared who knows what they're doing, because I'm going to guarantee you those courts are going to be backed up. Yeah. And, you know, just because you filed first doesn't mean you're going to get in first. So I think some of those are the situations that are going to be bad on the backside, is people not being, you know, in communication with either an attorney who's used to it and or with your tenants, to keep them somewhat abreast of how much they owe. And again, try to work something out where you can, you know, because if they've been great and they're, you know, clean tenants, they keep the place up and they maintain it, it's a fluke in their life. You know, you're going to, even when you're done with the eviction, you're going to have a mass of people looking for housing. And if you don't take people with evictions, you're not going to, how do you, you know, move some people forward? So I'm just telling you, be prepared to work with your tenants that have been good throughout the year before this.
Yeah, I think that's real good advice too. You know, and the other thing that one of the things we tell the owners is look at the different county websites, because I know we've had two owners specifically went through one of the Cook County websites and were able to get $10,000 grants. And I know they filed that before the end of last year. I know one check came from some women's league, whatever it was. And then I forgot where the other one had come through, but that was kind of like the IDA payments for the tenants, where they were getting $5,000. You know, these two owners actually got $10,000. So there is, again, there's potentially money out there if you have time to go look for it. You know, there's, like I said, there's different programs that are out there, and just like the tenants too, honestly, you know, I think most tenants want to do the right thing, you know, but they're afraid to talk to the landlord or the owner, because now they're 1 month behind, 2 months behind, 3 months behind, and then they stop communicating. And from a landlord, that's very frustrating, because we want to work out some sort of payment plan with you. And as long as you're upfront with them, yeah, we understand you're having a hard time. Let's work out a payment plan. Let's work some structure out so that we know if more money becomes available, you need to be able to ready, you know, have your paperwork ready, have your ledgers ready, have everything ready to apply for whatever new program that may come up sooner than later.
I think it's worth pointing out that even in the IDA grant program, there's going to have to be some coordination and some cooperation. Because if the landlord applies, they have to, so how it's supposed to work, they have to get the tenants to sign off on it as well. And ideally, if the landlord wants that money directly, if the tenant applies, the landlord has to agree to that application to be paid directly. Otherwise, it would potentially go direct to the tenant, meaning there may be a delay in the money that the landlord would receive. So even if you just want to rely on the state funding program, cooperation and being in communication with each other is still going to be important.
Any other thoughts from the panel?
Well, I would agree with both Paul and Matt that, you know, we do need to do some research. Again, there's church organizations that are helping people, and you might need to, you know, encourage your tenant to search some of those out, because some of them, you know, you can send them the link and you can do whatever. Because I did that when we had the Illinois money that came through, and some tenants just didn't want to apply. It was like, you're nuts. you just got to do it because they had to do it initiate up front. So you might just, that little prod's not going to be a bad thing. We add one thing to the people with the PPP loans. Now, I'm not an accountant and I don't plan on playing one. But I know some people that were applied for that for some grant money too. And a lot of them go, I didn't get any because some of them don't realize that they're an employee of their company. And so they would put 0 employees. If they put 1, that was what qualified some people to get the money because they had 1 employee and they were the employee. Again, I'm telling you, get a CPA or accountant to help you with that because there's bookwork and all that other stuff, that has to go around with it. But I had several tenants that technically were self-employed, but they were companies, they were LLCs, and they just didn't understand the process of that, so they didn't get any money. And it would have helped some of those guys tremendously, even just to fund their business, which would have helped fund the rent coming in.
Thank you very much. That sounds like good advice. Yes, we are all stuck in the middle of a global pandemic. There are extenuating circumstances that has hit everybody at different levels, which is why all the governments at various levels have tried to step in and help people out. To the extent that you need to communicate with either your mortgage servicer or your landlord, your tenant, and try to work a way out through this, the money owed, whether it's for a mortgage or on your rent, is not going to magically disappear. Situations like this, we got to kind of swallow our pride a little bit and go ahead and ask for help where it's being offered, whether it's the government or charity. These are circumstances beyond our control, beyond even what our federal government can kind of wrap their head around. So don't be afraid to look for help. Check government resources, charities, churches, whoever can sort of ease the burden so that when we finally come out of this, we're all in better shape. And we're just scratching the surface of what's going on with all these various questions. So also consult legal professionals, accountants, to the extent that they can help you. Don't be afraid to reach out to the association, state and local level, and any government resources that you know. I want to thank all the panelists again, and thank the viewers for tuning in.